Welcome to Proclaiming Justice, a podcast from PJTN that focuses the light of truth on vital issues in today's headlines that impact every American. I'm your host, Laurie Cardoza Moore, founder and president of Proclaiming Justice to the Nations, and I'm here to educate, motivate, and activate you to action. I want to arm you with the truth and the facts you'll need to fight and preserve our constitutional republic and uphold the Judeo-Christian values our nation was founded upon. Welcome to Proclaiming Justice, a PJTN podcast, and I'm your host, Laurie Cardoza Moore. If you missed the last episode of this podcast, you will find it and our previous podcast lineup on our website at pjtn.org, as well as all the other platforms that you use to access your favorite podcasts. On this week's podcast, I have invited back Rabbinit Yaffah Batya daCosta. She is founder and CEO of Anousim. Yaffah, thank you so much for joining us again on Proclaiming Justice.
Well, thank you, Laurie. I really appreciate your inviting me to join you because I really love doing these shows with you. It's fantastic.
I enjoy them as well, and I know our audience does. So, Yaffah, before we get into the questions, tell our audience a little bit about your organization so they have the background for those who are not familiar with your organization.
Okay, so I live in Jerusalem, and this is a nonprofit organization. Ezra in Hebrew means help, and La Anousim, there's an L apostrophe, Anousim. That word in Hebrew means forced or compelled. And the Lamed, the L in front of it, means to. So the whole thing means help to the Anousim, or the forced ones. Okay? Mm-hmm. And it relates to the Sephardi Jews of Spain and Portugal and their colonies who were forcibly converted to Roman Catholicism, starting in the 14th century and then on into the 15th century. And then they were expelled, of course, most people know, in 1492, etc. Mm-hmm. And many of them went to the New World, which is today what's called Latin America, the countries from Mexico on down, including all the Caribbean countries and, of course, all of South America. And the Inquisition, which came after the forced conversions, followed them there. And so these people, the descendants of the forced converts for hundreds of years, had to hide their Jewishness because of that persecution. And so today, the Hebrew way of calling them Anousim, or B'nai Anousim, children of, descendants of Anousim, is because they actually are the living, myself included, the living descendants of the people of that history of the forced conversions and the Inquisitions. And, you know, compared to the Holocaust, horrible, both of them, there were not as many people killed and burnt at the stake during the Inquisitions. The numbers weren't as large, but the amount of time was over 300 years that this went on in Latin American countries. So the number of people wasn't as great, but the impact on Latin America was just incredible, just like the Shoah, I mean, different ways, and the trauma and all of that. So now there are people with this ancestry, we call them secret Jews or crypto Jews or B'nai Anousim. And there are people with this ancestry who either have strong evidence or actually can prove their mother's female line all the way back to the Inquisition. And they've been starting to come back over the past, at least 30 years, you know. And my organization, because I also returned and came back to the faith and traditions of my ancestors, okay, so I'm also of this people group. So I started this nonprofit in Israel to help them, not only with their spiritual return in terms of publicly being Jewish again, not secretly or privately, okay, but also to be accepted as a Jew, have their Jewish identity confirmed, if you will, or acknowledged by an authority like a Beit Din. Okay, so they can also make Aliyah, which is what I also did. So that's what we do. We help them in every way that we can, and we've got like about a dozen people in the pipeline right now mainly from Latin American countries, but we actually, to be truthful, we help people with this ancestry of forced conversion of ancestors. We help people like this from all over the world, not just
Hmm.
Latin.
Yeah, it's a fantastic organization and one that I personally am interested in as well because of my own family background and family history. And of course, one of the excuse me, one of the things that we have been involved in is producing at PJTN, producing documentary films. The next documentary is actually about the Inquisition, the lost Jews of the Inquisition, to find out where they went. And that's why I'm so intrigued by your organization and the work that you do. But, as I first started getting involved in pro-Israel activity back, gosh, 23 years ago, I was an avid student of the Bible, studying the scriptures. And there always seemed to be some confusion with regards to Paul's writings and what was written in the Torah, the prophets, and the writings. And we know that within Christianity, there's been a history of Greco-Romanism. And of course, that comes out of Constantine, it comes out of the Catholic Church. But there's been a lot of conversations, debates over Paul's writings. And I want to talk to you today because of that confusion over Paul's writings, you have done a lot of research on his writings as well, on Greco-Romanism, where it came from, and why we have this confusion within the writings. So, what is the difference between Paul's exaltation of Jesus and the later Greco-Roman exaltation of Jesus?
Well, see, Paul and his writings, of course, fits right into Jewish history, Jewish theology. He quoted the Hebrew Bible. And so theologically, it's a form of Judaism, but for non Jews. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what he was bringing out to Asia Minor in those various cities, Ephesus and Thessalonica, and all those places that he wrote to. And basically, he was bringing to them, now this is a pagan world,
Mm-hmm.
okay? And they're worshiping multiple gods, and they have all these temples to gods that have human form. And that's what the Greco-Roman world was about. Well, that's not what Paul was about, nor the Nazarene sect in Jerusalem, made up
Mm-hmm.
of James and Peter and John. Okay, the leaders of it was a sect of Judaism called the Nazarene sect. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
it's understood in Judaism that that's one of the sects that existed in the Second Temple period, along with the Sadducees and the Pharisees and the Essenes and the rebels, of course, who caused a rebellion against Rome later, and a group called the Sicarii. But
Mm-hmm.
all right, so those were all the sects in the Second Temple period. Well, Paul was a part of the Nazarene sect, and he himself was a Jew, of
Mm-hmm.
course, and all the others were Jewish, and Jesus of Nazareth was a Jew. So they were coming from the perspective of the Hebrew Bible.
So you're saying, just to be clear for our audience, he was not opposed to the Torah. Because a lot of Christians, I've had conversations with Christians about this, and they'll say, oh no, Paul did away with all of that. He said we didn't have to keep the Torah, we didn't have to follow those commandments. And I would say, well, wait a minute. If this is, Paul is supposed to be a Hebrew of Hebrews, he was very learned. And if he was, why would he teach in opposition to the Torah?
Well, he actually didn't, and there's actually a line in the book of Acts where Luke, who's the author of the book of Acts, rather, is talking about Paul and his travels and all kinds of things about Paul. And he actually quotes Paul in saying that he's a typical Jew, observant of the Torah,
Mm-hmm.
and committed to the worship of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, or something like that. So they'd have to
Mm-hmm.
read it in the book of Acts, okay? But the other thing is, and here's what I think may cause the confusion, what Paul wrote in his letters was to Gentiles. He was not writing to Jews.
Mm.
So if people read what he wrote as if he's a reformer of Judaism and telling Jews they don't have to observe the Torah from Mount Sinai, okay, he's an apostate. He's actually an apostate Jew if that's what he's doing.
Mm-hmm.
But he called himself, and he was called by others and referred to by others as the apostle to the Gentiles. So he was teaching the Gentiles about the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, okay, and telling them they did not have to convert to Judaism. That's what he was telling the Gentiles, okay? But they did have to observe the moral code that was given to all mankind in the Torah, okay? So it's two different, if you will, categories of law. One that was given to the Israelites, who later become the Judeans, as you know. But the other is to the non-Jews. Now, here's the way it goes. In Israel at that time, Judea, at that time, there were two kinds of gerim. The word ger means stranger. Okay? There was a ger tzedek and a ger toshav. These are Hebrew words. Now, the ger tzedek, the righteous stranger, fully converted to Judaism and became a Jew. But the ger toshav, and this is in Judea, this was commonplace in Judea, but the people who were not Jewish in Judea during the Second Temple period, who wanted to come closer to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, okay, and worship that God, right, but didn't or couldn't or for whatever reason didn't want to fully convert to Judaism, what they did was they left paganism, if they had been involved with that before, and they became a ger toshav, which translates into a resident alien or resident stranger, meaning they could live in the land of Israel, no problem, as long as they observed the moral code that was given to all mankind. Paul takes this concept that exists in Judea. He studied under Gamaliel, which it states that very clearly in the book of Acts, and he takes this concept of ger toshav, a stranger or an alien, okay, but they're people who are no longer worshiping the gods of the Greco-Roman world, if they ever did. And by the way, we have proof of this. And here's the proof. The early Christians were persecuted by the Romans, by the Roman Empire, because the Jews had dispensation. They did not have to worship the emperor and burn incense to his image and all this other stuff. But Gentiles, non-Jews, did not have that kind of exclusion or ability. They didn't have to participate in those pagan festivals and stuff. So when the lower class people, the poor people, the lower class, because the Roman Empire was very hierarchical, okay, and there was an aristocracy and all this other stuff. But the poor people, the lower class people, were flocking to Christianity. I'll tell you what. Part of it was because of the ethics of Judaism, where you're supposed to give to the poor, you're supposed to help the poor. Paul even collected money for the Nazarene sect in Jerusalem, the people in Jerusalem, okay, from his groups, from his communities.
Right.
So the poor people and the lower class people who were not equal in Roman society to other people, they found equality. They found gender equality. They found class equality. Everybody was equal in these Christian groups. Of course, they were first called Christians in Antioch, okay? And that's what Paul was bringing out to Asia Minor, to this place. By the way, I have studied this for 50 years and I taught it for 30 years. I used to have my own radio show. It was live call-in radio in Massachusetts, and then I brought it with me when I went to Texas, and people would call in with tough questions, okay? And it was about the Jewish roots of Christianity. So what I call nascent Christianity, other people call Pauline Christianity, and had nothing to do with worship of pagan gods, with pagan protocols and pagan practices and all this Greco-Roman stuff. It had nothing to do with it.
Yes, absolutely. And thank you for that clarification because it is quite confusing. How does this view about the difference between Paul's views and the Greco-Roman Church's views influence Jewish-Christian relations even today?
Well, there are people who get involved in Jewish-Christian relations or interfaith dialogue, okay? But the subject of anti-Semitism is a very, very touchy subject. I think the reason why it's so touchy is because it's not fair. Just from my standpoint, having known so much about Christianity and then come into Judaism fully, and returned and all this stuff. And I can see it so clearly that it's not fair that people have been taught anti-Semitic tropes, which means falsehoods, and they're not being taught the foundation of where these came from and the history of where anti-Semitism in the Greco-Roman world came from to begin with. And so a lot of people will say, and they just don't know because they don't know, they haven't studied the history. And so a lot of people will say, well, Christian anti-Semitism goes back 2,000 years. And it's not true. Okay? It's Greco-Roman anti-Semitism. That's where it started, which was merged with Pauline Christianity to create the Roman version of Christianity, which I call version 2.0. Okay? So there's 2.1 and 2.0. I mean, right. Version 1, version 2. But Greco-Roman theology and their mindset and the anti-Semitism of the Greco-Roman world goes back 2,300 years, not 2,000. So there's a root cause, an ultimate root cause of anti-Semitism that most people don't know about because it's not taught, it's not being explained to people. And it goes back to the writings of a priest in Alexandria, Egypt, named Manetho, and people can look this up on the internet if they want to read all about it. It's in there. The name is spelled Manetho, and right around the same time, 3rd century before the Common Era, BCE, right around the time the Septuagint Bible is created, in the same place, in Alexandria, in Egypt. They took the Hebrew Bible, the Torah anyway, at that point, that was the first thing to be translated into Greek. And this Egyptian priest wrote in Greek also. We're talking about the Hellenistic world. Okay,
right.
And he wrote a history of Egypt. Okay? And in his history of Egypt, he wrote the exact opposite of the story of the Exodus from what Moses wrote in the book of Exodus in the Torah. And there are people who have written about this who say it was like an apologetic. It was like saving face for the Egyptians, because the story of Moses and what happened to the Israelite people, and they were made slaves originally. They were accepted, of course, and what Joseph had done for the Egyptians and all of that story, and then Jacob brings down his whole family and all of that. Okay. Many years later, they were enslaved by a different Pharaoh, okay, and made to work, very aggressively in slavery and killing of babies and, the whole thing. Right. Well, this priest didn't like that story, that way of explaining it. So he wrote a different story, okay, and oh my, it is very, very different. By the way, we don't have his history of Egypt. We only know about it because of Josephus. Josephus wrote about this man named Manetho, okay, in his book called Against Apion, okay, if they want to read Josephus. But he tells a story, Manetho tells the story of the Exodus upside down. In the Bible, it's an act of liberation of the Jewish people or the Israelites by God from Egyptian bondage. In Manetho's anti-biblical history, it's an expulsion of the Jews from Egypt at the command of the Egyptian gods, because their country has to be purified of unclean people. They were called lepers, they were called shepherds, they were accused of killing Egyptian gods, namely like the sheep, okay, which was another thing against them. He wrote that they hate humankind, they hate mankind, they're terrible people. I mean, I could go on and on, and I won't. Okay, so if people want to know more about what he wrote, they can read Josephus, and they can just look up Manetto. There's a Wikipedia article about him, and there's maybe other stuff. But people aren't taught this stuff, so they don't know that this thing we call anti-Semitism today, the historians called the manifestation of this in ancient times xenophobia. That's what they called it.
Oh.
The term anti-Semitism only goes back to the 1800s, to a man in Germany who coined that term. But it's the same thing. That is what it was. And 2,300 years old, and we still have it today. That's because people aren't taught.
Yeah, we absolutely do. And unfortunately, because of the work that we do at Proclaiming Justice to the Nations, we're trying to educate Christians about their biblical duty to stand with Israel and the Jewish people against the rise of global anti-Semitism. And it is so pervasive today. It's actually horrifying to see how quickly it was able to rise up and to the level that it has. We see it on college campuses. So you would think that our educated kids that we send off to college to get some, history and some education, that they would learn these things. But unfortunately, that is not the case. And so we have not only students in higher ed, we have kids in K through 12 who are being taught from curriculum, textbooks that continue to perpetuate this hatred of the Jews by blaming them for, whatever social ills we are facing. I mean, we saw it with COVID. They were blaming the Jews about the COVID virus and then the vaccine. So it's quite a challenge. And of course, my big concern within the religious world or Christianity is that Christians should be reading their Bibles. Pastors should be teaching or preaching from them. But unfortunately, the pastors are uneducated. They're going to seminaries where this type of history is not being discussed. There are all the anti-Semitic tropes that are in the New Testament scriptures. People use them against the Jews to blame the Jews for killing Christ. The blood libel, we saw it even with a popular thought leader, Candace Owens, accusing the Jews of a blood libel, killing kids in Gaza and taking their blood and using their blood to make matzahs. I mean, when I heard her say this, I thought to myself, is this woman for real? It's frightening how ignorant.
Yeah, that's from the Middle Ages. Actually, that blood libel goes all the way back to Middle Ages, where, people, everyday people, common people didn't have the Bible. Only the monks and the priests. And they had these scrolls that kept getting, copied and copied and copied and copied. But those were the people who held the actual texts until the printing press came out. And it was also in Latin. A lot of people didn't understand Latin. So until you have the King James, the first one in English, okay, of the Bible, of both, the first century writings and, of course, the Hebrew writings, all in one, Christian Bible, until you had that, the common people didn't know anything about anything except what they were told and taught by the monks and the priests and all that, who, again, because of the Greco-Roman anti-Semitism, that had carried down. And by the way, it doesn't come from Paul, and it doesn't even come from any of the what's called New Testament writings. It's not anti-Semitic tropes in the New Testament. There are none. It's texts and verses that are misunderstood because they're taken out of context, and people aren't taught the proper context of what's being said in the Jewish world, because Jesus was a Jew, Paul was a Jew, James and Peter, all of them were Jews. So if their things are taken out of context of the Judaism of the day, and the second major piece of context of the New Testament is the Roman occupation of Judea and how brutal it was and how horrific it was and how the Romans treated the Jews, because they hated them, but they couldn't do anything about them. The emperor had
Right.
said, no, you have to leave them alone. They have a right to their religion, leave them alone and all this stuff. But they were absolutely hated again because of this Greek writing of the
Mm-hmm.
history of Egypt and all of what Batya wrote. That caused the whole Greco-Roman world, Greek world, and then the Greco-Roman world to hate these people. So, no, people aren't being taught correctly about these New Testament texts and about the context. So let me give you an example. When Matthew is writing about Jesus being before Pilate, okay, and that whole story of what happened,
Mm-hmm.
and people don't understand when these documents were written. All the Gospels were written either at the time of the destruction of the temple in 70 of the Common Era, that's Mark, or at least 15 years later, which is Matthew and Luke, and John is the latest one written between 90 and 110. So if they don't know when these documents were written, okay, again, that's another aspect of context. Now, that temple was destroyed in 70 of the Common Era, but it wasn't just the temple was destroyed. 100,000 Jews were killed in the Galilee, which is where the uprising started against Rome, and 1 million or more than 1 million Jews were killed in Jerusalem, slaughtered in Jerusalem. Okay, so if you had been living at that time, just think about it for a minute, your audience as well. If you'd been living at that time and you either knew about or you actually saw what the Romans did, okay, in 70, and then they destroyed Masada by 73, okay,
Right.
and there were these magistrates that were called censors. That was their title. And they actually did censorship. They actually censored any scroll or document, which was a scroll at that time, ancient times, that was not pro Roman. It had to be pro Roman and
Mm-hmm.
against
Right.
Jews, especially after the war, that first war. And there was a second war later, but just that first war from 66 to 73.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're writing at that time, even if you're writing about Jesus of Nazareth and all the other stuff, and you're Matthew, so you tell me, are you going to write something that's pro-Roman or pro-Jew?
Mm-hmm. Right. Yes.
Right?
Good point.
Okay.
Good
So,
point.
so he writes that whole story. He's the only one that has in any of the four Gospels this story about, and the mob were clamoring for Jesus to be
Mm-hmm.
crucified. And at the end of this part of the story, he says he has the mob saying, his blood be
Mm-hmm.
on us and on our children, on our heads, whatever, however it's stated in the Gospel of Matthew. Okay, so, and, he has Pilate, washing his hands, in the
Right.
bowl of water and claiming that this man is innocent. His wife had told him she had a dream,
Right.
and he's an innocent man,
Mm-hmm.
everything. So Pilate absolves himself, okay, of responsibility for the killing of this man, this innocent man. The Jews, according to Matthew's gospel, okay, are saying, okay, let his blood be on us and on our children. That was used to persecute Jews for many generations.
Mm-hmm.
That
Right.
statement from the mob, okay? But then Roman centurions go take him off, scourge him, and actually lift him up on a cross and crucify him. And of course, that is a Roman form of
Right.
execution, not Hebrew, not Jewish. So the Romans actually killed him, even though he has this whole story. So the whole way he weaves that story is pro-Roman and anti-Jewish. That's what Matthew decided to do. Well, what would you do if he's writing
Mm-hmm.
in 85, 15 years after the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem and the slaughter of over 1 million people? What do you think?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And there are censors, and the censors are very sensitive to anything anti-Roman. There was just a revolt
Right.
15 years earlier.
Right. Well, that was the concern too of the hierarchy of Judaism, the leaders, because they thought for sure that the Roman government was going to come after them if they didn't put the kibosh on this movement. So it was a threat to the Jewish community.
That's
But
the
it's
way it's written. But the thing is, we really don't know, and we probably will never know actually if any of that is true. Okay? Because the author of the book of Matthew, and by the way, all the Gospels, nobody knew the authorship in the early church.
Right.
They didn't know. They simply called them the evangelists because
Mm-hmm.
they were spreading good news about salvation now being offered to Gentiles if they're also going to worship the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's false
Mm-hmm.
message. And
Mm-hmm.
salvation is by faith through grace and not of works, which is Judaism too.
Mm-hmm.
So all these things that people think, well, Paul's different and Paul's a reformer and he's reforming Judaism just like Jesus was creating a new religion,
Right.
none of that is
Right.
true. So we don't know, especially because of the Roman Jewish War and how brutal it
Mm-hmm.
was and how many people were slaughtered. We really don't know for sure if these were stories that were given over to people, okay,
Mm-hmm.
in a way that would make the Jews look bad so the censors would not destroy the scrolls. We really don't know.
Right. Right.
But
Right.
we do know they were terrified of the Romans, and we do know that there were these magistrates called censors,
Mm-hmm.
and they had two jobs. One was to censor anything that was anti Roman, and
Mm-hmm.
two was to develop propaganda that was pro Roman.
Mm-hmm. And what about Josephus? Because him being a historian and he's recognized within not just the Jewish world, but also the Christian world, he's referenced. What about Josephus? I mean, did he write from this perspective? Was he also someone who was concerned because he actually worked for the Romans because
Yeah,
he was
he was a turncoat. He turned towards the Roman side, towards the emperor's side. Um, he actually told the emperor before he became emperor that he was going to become emperor. Okay, so
mm-hmm,
he got added to the Flavius family. They ended up calling him Josephus Flavius. But the thing is, he became a historian for the Romans,
mm-hmm,
and so one could say, well, to take some of the things that he wrote with a
mm-hmm,
little bit of grain of salt because it's well known from ancient times on that the winners write the history
mm-hmm, right,
and they write it from their perspective. I mean, that's well known today and well accepted and understood today by theologians, by history professors, and history buffs. So it depends on what you're looking at in Josephus, whether you
mm-hmm,
can believe him or not. But he
mm-hmm,
was, I think, my opinion, he was pretty good about describing Judaism of his day because he knew
mm-hmm,
Judaism and mentioning the various sects of Jews in that time period, et cetera, and so forth. So I think Josephus is a good source, but you wouldn't necessarily want to take him 100%,
right,
you know,
right,
as gospel if you want to call it that. But
mm-hmm,
uh, I don't know. But the thing is, this thing about the roots of anti-Semitism. Let's go into a little bit. I have this little thing about marketing. Okay,
mm-hmm,
there are markets that are fresh produce markets. Okay, going back to maybe like the 19th century, but then there's this thing called the market of ideas, where even if you're not selling a product, you might want to market an idea. You might want to try to get well known or accepted or influence people to have this new idea, whether it's
mm-hmm,
AI, for example, modern time technology, or whatever it is. And what happened was the way I understand it, based on all my studies and everything I looked at, is when the Roman church fathers who were highly anti-Semitic, and people
mm-hmm,
need to just read what they wrote. It's all on the internet. Irenaeus and Origen and Justin Martyr and Tertullian, who was the first one to use the term Trinity, by the way. There's no such of an idea in the Jewish context of Jewish scripture. Hashem is one, God is one.
mm-hmm,
One means literally singular.
mm-hmm,
Okay.
right,
Um, So that comes later, and it's okay. It's just people need to know where it comes from. It did not come from the Hebrew Bible. And people who try to twist and distort phrases and verses in the Hebrew Bible to make it look like that, they're not being honest.
mm-hmm,
Okay? It doesn't come from there. And in terms of Jewish Christian relations, if Christians could just understand that and not try to harass or tell Jews they're going to hell if they don't believe X, Y, Z. That was the Roman Church, and that was their marketing, because they felt that the Jewish religion was a competitor. It was.
Right.
The early Christian believers, they even went and became martyrs rather than burn incense to the emperor. For 300 years, they were fed to the lions. It had nothing to do with them believing in a certain person as a Jewish Messiah.
Right.
Nothing to do with that. It had to do with, because of Paul's teachings and the teachings of others, but mainly Paul, they had been taught to become ger toshav, that concept that I mentioned earlier.
Right.
Right, not a righteous goy, meaning converted Judaism, but a person who was accepted as a resident in Judea and then out in Asia Minor, accepted within these Jewish synagogues and Jewish communities, accepted because they had denounced, anything against God's will and the moral code, of the Torah. So what happened was they were killed for that. They were killed because as Gentiles, they were no longer worshiping the emperor or burning incense to him. That was early Christianity. I call it nascent Christianity, the earliest form. Other people call it Pauline Christianity. That's what that was. The early church fathers start writing in the 2nd century. And for 200 years, 250 years, they're starting to promote this other idea, of why don't we make this fellow like the emperors, like the Roman emperors after he died. Paul talked about him being exalted, but the history of that in the Jewish world is Eliyahu, the prophet, was taken up to heaven bodily. Enoch, it mentions in the Torah, Enoch. I think he comes after Methuselah or before Methuselah. Maybe he's the father of Methuselah. But if you look in the genealogy in the Torah, in the book of Genesis, it says Enoch walked with God, and God took him. So in Judaism, there are certain people. Serach is another one. Maybe there's like about half a dozen Jews, or even before Jews, like Enoch wasn't a Jew, but you know what I mean, in the Torah that were mentioned as ascending into heaven, being taken up bodily into heaven. So that exaltation of Jesus, if you want to call it that, with Paul talking about that, was not outside of Jewish thinking, Jewish mindset, Jewish background.
Interesting. Good point.
It got translated later into he became a god, because that's what the Romans did with their emperors. When an emperor died, the Senate voted on this and voted to make him a god, and they would build temples to that, Caesar Augustus and Caesar this one and Caesar that one, and they would build temples to these men who had been the emperors and worshipped as gods, but not in the Jewish mindset. No, they can be exalted, have an exalted status in heaven, like Enoch and Eliyahu and others, but that's not the same as making them into a power that's equal to God the Father. That's not a Jewish idea.
So, Yaffah, there's another group of people that I want to talk about, because we see in modern day anti-Semitism, we see the anti-Semitism coming from the far right, the left, and radical Islam. Christianity came way before Islam, but within Islam, there is also a similar hatred. We saw the manifestation of how intense that hatred is on October 7th, 2023. What about Islam? Where does their anti-Semitism come from? Where was its inception?
So Islam and Roman Christianity, I want to make it very clear because I'm not talking about Pauline Christianity. Roman Christianity and Islam, both of them adopted supersessionism. In other words, in their day of what they were promoting in the marketplace of ideas, they were promoting this idea that religion now, Christianity, when they started doing that, the Romans, and later when Islam started doing it, they were superseding religions that had preceded them. So Christianity, Roman Christianity was saying they now are supersessionist over Judaism. And when Islam comes along, they say the same thing, that they are now supersessionist over Christianity and over Judaism, and actually over Hinduism and Buddhism, which is not a religious philosophy, but any other religion, anyone who is not even moderate, Muslims, by the way, to the jihadis and the Islamists, anybody who's not like them, even their brother Muslims who are more moderate, are worthy of death because they're not like them. So they're the most extreme supersessionists of all. Okay. Now, in the beginning, in Islam, okay, they were trying to correct Christianity and bring the theology back to a one God theology, not multiple gods, not paganism, okay, and not the idea of a human being as a god. Because in the world of strict monotheism, God the Creator created everything else, and nothing that God created could be equal to God. And by the way, there was a schism in the church, in the Roman church, in the early 4th century between what was called Arianism. This is all in Alexandria, Egypt, by the way. Arianism and his opponent, who was called Athanasius, and they had to have a church council to resolve the dispute or the controversy. Because Arius, who was the founder of Arianism, said that Jesus was not equal to the Father. He prayed to the Father. He kept pointing to the Father. If you read those first century documents in context of Judaism, okay, he was a worshiper of God the Father.
Right.
So if people understand that, they would understand Arianism, that now this is a belief that, yes, he has an exalted status, but he's not equal to the Father. Okay? And Athanasius, his opponent, said no. He was the bishop of Alexandria, said no. He is equal to the Father in same substance, and on and on. So Constantine wanted to unite the empire in two ways. He wanted to get rid of all the pagan gods, because the pagan gods were all fighting with each other, and their followers were all fighting with each other. Okay, and so no, really, if you read the history,
oh gosh, what a mess!
He wanted to get rid of multiple gods. Okay, and he loved the idea of one God, just one, right? So he wanted to unify the his empire, under that concept of just one, monotheism, okay, one God. But he also needed to unify the Roman Christian church, because there was this controversy, this dispute, and it was all over the church, okay? Whether people were Arian, pro-Arian, or pro-Athanasius, okay? So they had the Constantine called this council at Nicaea in 325, early 4th century, to resolve this controversy. Arius lost. Okay, so they went with the concept of Athanasius, but now, oh, by the way, the reason why Arius lost was because if Jesus of Nazareth has an exalted status, but he's not equal to the Father, now you have two gods.
Right.
And Constantine had said, no, one God. You can only have one. Pick one, really, literally. So they couldn't go with Arius. Because that would mean that now there's two. So what they did was they created this concept of a trinity or a triunity, where God is one in three persons. That's the way it got resolved. And the Nicene Creed is very clear about this. And people have, by the way, I've worked with Christians for many, many years and taught them they have a right to their beliefs no matter where those beliefs came from. We're not trying to, in Judaism, we're not trying to change people's beliefs. Please, heaven forbid. Freedom of religion. But the Jews have not had freedom of religion since the early church fathers.
That's true. That's right. Good point.
Because of the antisemitism of the Greco-Roman world. That's what has to stop. Not that people have to change their beliefs, their religion, their theology, but to know where it comes from, I think, is good from a historical point of view.
Right.
And that it doesn't come from Paul, and it came after Paul. It came after the 1st century, starting in the early 2nd century. So knowing where it comes from and knowing about the disputes in the early... And by the way, one more thing, which is so critical to understand, and is so horrific. And that is when the council was over, okay, there were so many people on both sides that it went back and forth, depending on who was the emperor. Okay, sometimes you had an emperor that went with the Arian side, and now they were in power, and then it went back, another emperor would come up, and then it was on the Athanasius side. But by 381, Christianity was named the religion of the empire, and you could only have that religion. And if you believed in the Arian side, it was made a capital offense punishable by death. They
Wow.
slaughtered the competition.
Wow.
Absolutely. For centuries, they slaughtered people. And even today, there are Christian groups who the mainstream Christians believe aren't Christian because they don't believe in a human being as God, like the Jews. And
Right.
they're criticized and they're put down as Jehovah's Witnesses and this group and that group, whatever. But they're a very, very small minority of people in Christianity who don't believe in the Trinity.
Yes, this is a major issue even in Christianity today. But unfortunately, again, it goes back to what we said earlier. Without studying the Hebrew Bible, studying from a Hebraic perspective, the foundation, because as we discussed, his disciples were all Jews, and they were following Torah. But we've allowed these extra biblical beliefs, writings, to change what was initially believed. And unfortunately, even within, as we mentioned about Islam, you have another religion who has shown up instead of them studying from or understanding the scriptures from a Hebraic perspective, and instead interpreting the scriptures according to Muhammad, you have hatred because the religion isn't aligned with the original worship of the one true God, as Judaism gave to the world.
But that hatred is taught, that hatred is learned, that hatred, I used to say to my classes when I was running classes, a baby doesn't come out the chute hating anyone.
Right.
Or loving anyone, for that matter. Hate and love and all those emotions are taught or not. Okay? So people were raised this way and not knowing anything else and not allowed to learn anything else with opposing views. Okay? So, but that's the sad part is some people don't even know what they're saying is anti-Semitic.
Right.
And is totally wrong and incorrect and a falsehood and a lie that goes back to the Middle Ages, for example, the blood lentils, or it might go all the way back to Manetto 2,300 years ago. They don't know this stuff and they're not being taught this stuff. And that's the tragedy. And I'll tell you why. Because even in the Christian world, I think Christians listening to this show, and I'm sure you yourself, anti-Semitism is a sin. It's a sin from the perspective of the moral code, okay, in terms of one of the laws being not to steal. Because what happens is telling a lie about another human being or a whole group of people is stealing their reputation, stealing their good name, okay?
Oh, it's in violation of the 9th commandment, bearing false witness.
And that's the other one. If people don't if people do, exactly if people want to don't go along with this moral code idea for all mankind, and one of them being against theft and that concept, okay, you go to the 9th commandment. It's bearing false testimony. It's a sin, and unfortunately people don't know that they're sinning against another human being or against a whole group of people with these anti-Semitic falsehoods cultures. So we need to do a lot of education, and we need to just get out there and do it and teach people and get online and get on. Well, your podcast is a great one, but we need to just do it all over the place because it's horrific and people are dying. People are actually getting killed by folks who are anti-Semitic and hateful.
That's absolutely correct. And as we are coming toward the end of the program. Yaffah, is there anything else that we haven't discussed that you want to talk about before we sign off? I know we're going to have you come back because there's so much more to unpack about what you have shared with us today. And this is important to our audience because, you know, we've allowed, and God is very clear. I was studying with our Bible study group last night about Edom and the book of Obadiah, and even in the book of Ezekiel, the prophet. God is very clear. He is not going to allow Christians, Muslims, even Jews to just stand by while their brother Jacob is being attacked and murdered. Judgment is going to come. We're all going to have to face it. And he's going to, just like he told the Obadiah in the book. And I encourage our audience, read that book. It's only, I think, all of 21 verses, one chapter. But he said in the last days, and I'm paraphrasing, but you can go read it for yourself, ladies and gentlemen, that in the last days he was going to wipe out the descendants of Edom because they stood by while their brother Jacob, who is Jacob? It's Israel. It's all 12 tribes. While their brother Jacob was held in captivity and they did nothing. The world stood by on October 7th and just watched. Now, there were countries who rose up and took the side of Israel's, but the rest of the nations of the world just stood by. And you could hear the little comments being made, well, the Jews deserve it because they're occupying Palestinian land. No, ladies and gentlemen, there is no evidence. You cannot refer to any scripture in the Bible, even from Genesis to the book of Revelation, where that land does not belong to Israel, that it belongs to the Palestinians. There is no place. And the problem is that Christians, and I'm talking specifically about Christianity because this show is to Christians, but Christians have to study their Bible. You have to know, ladies and gentlemen, because you're going to stand before Almighty God. You can't say that we didn't know. That's what they said in Germany. All those Christians said, we didn't know this was going on. We didn't know that they were doing this to the Jews. Yes, they did. It was so obvious and evident. I get very upset about this because I think back to the Inquisition and I think back to the pogroms, and we never seem to correct the mistakes, our error in our ways and our belief system. It is time, once and for all, ladies and gentlemen, to rid Christianity of this scourge, of this hatred, this Jew hatred against our brother Jacob. So, Yaffah, you've got the final word on this conversation.
Well, I mean, I have to agree with you. And, there's more than just the hostages in Gaza who are in captivity. The B'nai Anousim in Latin America are in captivity as well. Practically nobody helping their brother. And even some Jews against them coming back. But it's because of the fear of Christianity and the fear of backlash from Christianity, where Christians might say, well, these people are actually Christians, not Jews. And so you're taking people out of Christianity, which isn't the case. But anyway, so we even got lack of help and support from other Jews to help these people who were descended from the forced converts of the Spanish and Portuguese. But I do have one other thing I want to leave your audience with this. There's in Psalms 85, verse 11, I want to leave people with this thought and an idea about archaeology, because there are skeptics out in the world, and I know there might be some people who are skeptical about some of the things that I've shared, which is okay. Psalms 85, verse 11, truth springs forth from the earth, and righteousness looks down from heaven. Okay? And what I want to tie that into is, and maybe we can talk about this on the next program, is between 1896 and 1907, two British archaeologists, Bernard Grenfell and Arthur Hunt, discovered over 500,000, that's 500,000 papyri fragments dating back 1,800 years.
Hmm.
And part of those fragments were from the Gospels, and part of those fragments were from the letters of Paul, and they haven't even gone through them all. They only started releasing some of these fragments in 2010, over 100 years later
Wow.
from when they were discovered.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that they discovered is in the book of John, chapter 16. People can look this up in their Bibles. There's verses in the regular Christian Bibles. There are 3 verses 14, 15, and 16 of the book of John, the Gospel of John, Gospel of John. There's a fragment of the Gospel of John from the mid-2nd century that was found amongst this cache of fragments. So it's dated back to the mid-2nd century, which doesn't have verse 15 in it. And verse 15 is used as a proof text for the Trinity. They also found that same chapter of the Gospel of John from the Codex Sinaiticus, which is a different time frame. It was 200 years later. Okay. And it does have that verse 15 in the text. So the earliest now, today, because of this cache that was found in Egypt, south of Cairo, okay, because of this cache, because of this fragment, the earliest fragment that we have now of the Gospel of John, chapter 16, does not have that verse in it that later shows up in Codex Sinaiticus. In other words, it was added later and is used as a proof text. But we know at that time was the controversy between Arius and Athanasius. And that's what was going on at that time. So, of course, they added in the Tola scribes to add that verse in because they were promoting the concept of the Trinity. So this is history. This is fact now. This isn't, what if.
Right.
This is actual fact, historical fact now.
Yaffah, this has been fantastic. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you found this program informative. We will post this podcast on our website and all of our podcast platforms so that you can share with your family and friends. As PJTN Watchmen, we have a biblical mandate to stand against the ungodly rising Nazi threat that is destroying this nation and other Western nations, threatening our Judeo-Christian values and promoting anti-Semitism. We cannot remain silent, ladies and gentlemen. God warned the prophet Ezekiel about the responsibility of the watchman. And if the watchman sees an enemy advancing and the watchman fails to warn the inhabitants of the city and any innocent blood is shed, it's going to be required of that watchman. Ladies and gentlemen, you're watchmen on the wall today. You're hearing biblical truths, things that are not discussed within Christianity. You have to share this information. The only way we're going to finally get out of this situation, repeating the mistakes of the past, the hatred of our Jewish brethren, as we have done in the past, is if we start educating ourselves about